To measure absolute historical influence between two radically disproportionate adversaries, we have to look past conventional metrics and strip morality entirely out of the equation. On one side, you have the ultimate manifestation of inherited, conventional, institutional power. On the other, the absolute extreme of stateless, asymmetric leverage. Evaluating these figures using traditional scorecards, like domestic policy wins or legislative output, creates a skewed and largely useless analysis. Instead, we can objectively score these two actors across 17 specific categories, spanning conventional power, charismatic authority, and asymmetric return on investment. Figuring out who actually imposed their will on the world requires a clinical calculation of the permanent outputs they achieved relative to the raw resources they started with. This chart measures their influence ROI. If we take their institutional resources on the x-axis and plot their geopolitical disruption on the y-axis, we see the exact leverage they achieved. The conventional institutional actor sits squarely in the far bottom right quadrant, possessing maximum resources to achieve moderate to high disruption. The stateless actor lands in the top left quadrant, utilizing near zero institutional resources to trigger extreme global disruption. The inputs for this framework are the advantages an actor begins with or acquires through the system: inherited wealth, established political backing, and massive media apparatuses. The outputs are the permanent geopolitical consequences they force, specifically the systemic overreactions they trigger from their adversaries. True disruption comes down to the sheer cost imposed on a target relative to the original capital spent to inflict it. We begin by analyzing the absolute maximization of inherited capital as a primary tool for influence. This document shows exactly where that capital started, detailing how Donald Trump received the modern equivalent of at least $413 million from his father's real estate empire. Moving down, the records expose the mechanisms used to artificially amplify those resources, including a trusted bookkeeper buying $3.5 million in casino chips without placing a single bet, and a legal loan used to prevent a bond default. The text here highlights the strategic discrepancy at play, claiming a net worth over $10 billion, while objective estimates, like Bloomberg's, placed it closer to $2.8 billion, using the illusion of limitless capital to project market dominance. Deploying that massive institutional wealth yields highly localized domestic outcomes, driving legislation like major corporate tax cuts. But utilizing the system to this extent comes with immense legal exposure and continuous institutional friction. Conventional wealth guarantees physical survival and supreme comfort, but it permanently anchors the actor to the very rules of the system they are trying to manipulate. This brings us to the acquisition of formal political authority and global media dominance. Taking the oath of office for the United States presidency serves as the ultimate institutional amplifier for top-down influence. That authority is coupled with decades of media saturation, leveraging platforms like reality television to cultivate and protect a highly potent cultural mythology. In the first evaluation phase, wealth, political power, media influence, and organizational influence all go to the conventional actor. Holding this office forces organizational compliance, requiring an established political party to align with your agenda in order to govern. Owning the system grants immense top-down control, but it inherently restricts your ability to completely dismantle or terrorize global structures. Both subjects bypass these traditional structures entirely by utilizing charismatic authority. Deep emotional connection is weaponized to physically mobilize followers, directing their collective belief against established legal and rational orders. We score this phase as a split. They tie on the ability to command followers, while Trump takes financial risk-taking and Bin Laden takes personal resilience. The primary structural weakness here is that authority rooted entirely in emotion, rather than robust bureaucracy, requires constant visibility. Personality-driven movements are unstable. If the leader is permanently removed from the spotlight, the basis of their authority immediately begins to break down. This leaves asymmetric tactics and the utilization of extreme, stateless violence. Executing stateless, asymmetric warfare requires minimal conventional resources and negligible capital to locate the vulnerabilities within highly complex networks. By exploiting those vulnerabilities, an initial investment of barely $500,000 triggered a massive, multi-trillion-dollar global military overreaction known as the War on Terror. These actions institutionalize new protocols for commercial travel, domestic security apparatuses, and foreign policy norms that remain in place decades later. In the final phase, historical impact and geopolitical consequences go decisively to the asymmetric actor. Achieving this extreme level of disruption requires an absolute, non-negotiable trade-off. Asymmetric strategy demands sacrificing the physical survival of the individual in order to force a permanent, systemic shift in the adversary's behavior. Synthesizing these 17 categories gives us a final, calculable metric to compare these adversaries: the ROI ratio. Comparing the institutional actor's resources spent against adversarial resources burned shows a 1-to-1 equilibrium. But adding the asymmetric data, the disparity is visible. A microscopic expenditure sits next to a forced adversary burn reaching into the trillions. Billions of dollars were spent and leveraged to achieve localized domestic political shifts. Contrast that against mere millions spent to force trillions in global security reactions. The overarching strategic objective of asymmetric warfare is exactly this: bleeding an adversary's economy by forcing them to over-defend everywhere simultaneously. Raw historical disruption is mathematically dominated by actors who force their opponents to absorb exponentially larger costs than they expend. Looking strictly at the data, the final verdict on who achieved greater overall historical influence comes down to what kind of leverage you are willing to use. Conventional power secures comfort, incredibly high visibility, and significant but ultimately restrained structural control. Asymmetric power forces an adversary to adopt permanent security and travel protocols at the absolute cost of total organizational and physical annihilation. This identifies a specific vulnerability in how global influence is projected. A global superpower's greatest vulnerability is rarely a rival state with comparable wealth. It is a stateless actor willing to brutally exploit the fundamental fragility of its systems.